Thanks for tuning into Talking Point Unfiltered. Corey Richards, a photographer, once said that there is a beauty that remains with us after we have stopped looking. In that similar vein, there will be learnings from this conversation that will remain with me for sure and will remain with you long after this conversation is done. Thanks for tuning into this podcast, and our guest today is one of the finest economic brains in the country, according to me, and arguably across the Asia-Pacific region now, Sajid Chinoy of JP Morgan. Sajid, great having you. Thanks for joining in.
Neeraj, always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So Sajid, we've chosen this particular topic because I read a note from you on that as well, and that is Trump 2.0 and the ramifications that that presidency potentially could have, right? Now, some people view it as a glass half full, some people view it as a glass half empty. From your lens, from a business perspective and an economic perspective, how do you see it?
Thank you, Neeraj. I'm not surprised that there are these mixed reactions, because I think the Trump economic agenda is multiple fronts to it, and it's not fully understood, right? And therefore, it brings both excitement, worry, horror in equal measure. The first part we know of, which is Mr. Trump or President-elect Trump has said that he views tariff as a beautiful word in the dictionary, and he wants to slap on tariffs on China in particular and potentially in other emerging markets. He's also said that he wants to slow the flow of immigration to the US and potentially result in some deportation. Now, why is this of concern to economists both inside the US and outside? So let's talk about the US itself. I think the dirty little secret is that the US resilience in the last 3 years that we've all been in awe of has been in large part because we've had very high levels of immigration. And think of that as the supply curve moving out. More people coming in the labor market, so demand can be strong, but because there are more workers, wages don't go up very much. So you get higher growth without higher inflation. Right? And so the one concern is that if you were to slow the pace of immigration or in the limit result in large deportation, you're doing the opposite. You're pushing the supply curve out, which in principle means less growth or lower activity and higher prices, higher inflation. Then you have the talk of a tariff. And we don't know what shape or form this will take, but tariffs in general are also an adverse supply shock. So both of these things will be an adverse supply shock, which means you'd get lower growth and higher inflation, and that's what's been of some concern to economists. But there are other parts of his agenda which are not fully appreciated, which is what's causing excitement in markets, which is if he wants to deregulate, there'll be a lot of deregulation across sectors. I think there's talk of the financial sector, oil and gas, maybe cryptocurrencies. Now, of course, there are going to be risks down the line if you over deregulate, but in the near term, this is good for corporate profits, and therefore, some businessmen and markets are very excited about the fact that there'll be more deregulation, and they think of this as being both growth enhancing and the supply curve moving out. And then there's the fourth element, which is that you'll have looser fiscal policy. Now, personally, this worries me because, as we've discussed in the past, a few months ago, US fiscal dynamics are already very precarious at this point in time. US debt has been rising very sharply, deficits are large, the economy is doing very well. Typical macroeconomic policy would argue for tightening fiscal deficit, reducing fiscal deficits and tightening fiscal policy, not loosening it. But from the perspective of growth, if you're in the stock market, you're saying, well, more fiscal easing, so higher growth, more deregulation, so higher growth. And hence the mixed reaction, because some people look at the deregulation part and look at the fiscal easing part and say, this is good for growth, this is good for earnings, this is good for equity markets. Others will focus on the immigration and the tariffs and say, this is bad for US growth and will cause higher inflation, which means the Fed cannot ease as much. So if you're in the US, you'll have these mixed reactions. If you're outside the US, and I'll end with that, it's clearly a source of worry and concern, because you don't get the benefit of deregulation or fiscal policy directly. There'll be second order effects, but firsthand you face the immigration hit and you face the higher tariffs. So I think hence this very schizophrenic reaction to the Trump economic agenda.
Yeah, I think, I'm trying to approach this first from a perspective of people who are sitting outside, because we are sitting outside, Sajid. And I think the initial reaction that most people have is, there's going to be a lot of tariffs on China.
Yes.
And therefore China should be worried.
Yes.
The others shouldn't be worried.
Yes.
Your base case is about from tariffs on Chinese imports increased from 20% to 60%, right?
Correct.
What are the first order and second order implications of something like this if this were to happen in its shape and form on China and thereby on the other Asian markets or the Asian economies, including India?
Great question, Neeraj. So it's important to, I think, systematically look at the different channels of transmission. And remember, there was already a trade war in the past in 2018 where the US raised tariffs from about 3% on China to 20%. The idea is now to go from 20 to 60. So we're going to take the president at his word because this is a core part of his agenda. What does this mean for Chinese growth? Without the tariffs, in any case, China has been struggling with growth over the last year. It's not so much the quantum of growth. We think China will grow around 4.8% this year. It's really the imbalanced nature of the growth, that there's been too much focus on the supply side in China, not enough on the demand side. Consumption is really weak, consumer sentiment is very weak, and so China's got too much supply, not enough demand, and therefore large levels of excess capacity, which has been deflationary for China, and that deflation is spilling over into other parts of Asia. That's your starting point. Now, absent the tariffs, our China economists had believed that growth next year would be about 4.5% in China. The tariffs itself, if taken literally from 20% to 60% or so, will shave off 2 percentage points of Chinese growth by our estimates. So if nothing else happened, China's growth next year would be 2.5% from the tariffs. But of course, China will respond. China will respond with more fiscal policy, more fiscal easing. China will respond with more monetary easing. And most importantly, China will weaken its currency as a response to higher tariffs. We saw this in 2018. US tariffs went from 3 to 20. China's bilateral exchange rate, the Chinese yuan against the dollar, depreciated by 13%. Right, to try and offset the impact of the tariffs so that Chinese goods, when priced in dollars, are cheaper before the tariffs are imposed, and the price hit in dollars is not as much as the tariffs would suggest. So if you combine the fiscal easing, the monetary easing, and the currency depreciation, you're looking at Chinese growth closer to about 3.7, 3.8. Now, I think the point estimates don't matter. Impossible to estimate given the uncertainty.
Of course.
But this is going to be a large hit to Chinese growth, is the first order impact. The second order impact is that there is a belief here that the rest of Asia will be relatively insulated, right? That this is a US-China problem. And I think that's a really worrying assumption to make.
Actually, people think it's China, so China will lose out and others will benefit.
Correct. And I think we have to take an intertemporal perspective here, that in the medium term, that's exactly right, that if you get another US-China trade war, the diversification that we're seeing outside of China should accentuate. You should get more proclivity of China plus one. FDI should flow to other parts of the region. And more importantly, Chinese FDI will start to look for other homes in the region. We saw this happen in Vietnam and Malaysia in the first trade war. This might spread to other countries in this trade war. That's the medium-term benefit. But there'll be a lot of near-term gain. And it's important to go through what are the different channels of transmission. The first is if China's growth gets hit, from above 4 to below 4, there are many countries in the region that are very exposed to China from a trade perspective. For the rest of Asia, almost 1/4 of all exports go to China. Now, in India's case, we're relatively insulated because only 5% of our exports go to China. So we will be saved from that channel, but other Asian countries will be hit. The more worrying channel for the rest of Asia and for India, I think, is the second one, which is the starting point here is that China has a lot of excess capacity. And that excess capacity so far was going to the US. Now, if the US were to impose tariffs, guess what? That excess capacity will be redirected to the rest of Asia and other countries, other emerging markets, but also the rest of Asia. So one should begin to worry that more cheap Chinese imports will flood local economies. We've had this issue in India, and I'll come back to it, but already we're seeing that Indonesia has threatened to put on 200% tariffs on Chinese imports because it's hurting domestic manufacturing. The Thai authorities have said they believe China is exporting deflation, so they're getting concerned. And in India, we've been talking about the fact that imports from China are elevated across the board. We're probably looking at a bilateral trade deficit with China this year, which is among the highest in the last 10 years.
Wow.
And this is before the tariffs are imposed. So after the tariffs, the worry is that domestic manufacturing in many countries in the region will have to compete with very cheap Chinese imports. That might be hard to do, and that will hurt domestic manufacturing prospects. In India, we talk about the corporate capex cycle, and one of the reasons I think that we've seen caution on that front is that A, of course, you need to see more demand visibility, but B, if you're competing with cheap Chinese imports and there's all this excess capacity in some part of the world, why should you add to the excess capacity? And so that's a concern in India. So I think that's the second channel we should be worried about. And many countries in the region may be tempted to put on tariffs. So then suddenly a bilateral trade war between the US and China becomes a regional global trade war, right? The third channel is the currency. So here's again the dirty little secret that the US tried to reduce China's export presence in the world by putting on tariffs last time around, right? But because China depreciated its currency, it became competitive vis-a-vis all other emerging markets. It lost market share in the US, it gained market share everywhere else around the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, right, in Latin America, in Asia. And thereby China's share of global exports actually went up, not down, despite the US tariffs. So other currencies will have to be very nimble about how you respond to a weaker currency, because nobody expects other currencies to move one-to-one with the Chinese yuan. But if you don't move enough, then you become uncompetitive vis-a-vis China. That makes Chinese imports even cheaper, and that means you lose competitiveness in third markets. The two final channels, if there's this competitive devaluation happening in the region and currencies are under pressure, it becomes harder for central banks to cut interest rates. In our forecast, we had many central banks in Asia cutting interest rates because real interest rates across all of Asia are elevated. Core inflation is soft in most countries. Most of these economies are below their pre-pandemic path. But the ability of central banks to cut rates gets compromised if your currencies are under consistent pressure, you're selling dollars to prevent more depreciation, and a weaker currency is causing more domestic inflation. So that's the fourth channel. And the last channel is, through all of this uncertainty, hard for business sentiment or animal spirits to flourish. So we should not believe that, this is a US-China problem. This is very much an Asia problem.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to try and peel off a couple of these points, if you will. And maybe let's start with the first one, the last one that you said, which is animal spirits, private capex, etc. So we've been waiting for private capex to come up, right? Could it well be that businessmen have foreseen that there is going to be a potential issue like this, and if demand is not seen on the ground because China may dump, there is no point in putting up capex just for the just for the sake of putting capex. So could it well be that this much anticipated private capex cycle, which is in bits and pieces in sectors but not across, might get delayed for the foreseeable future?
I think that's a very real risk, not just for India, but for many countries in the region, that already countries are grappling with cheap Chinese imports, large quantums in many countries. And that means, if there is all this excess capacity coming in and it's finding it hard to compete with these imports, why would you make big risks or take big risks by undertaking large fixed investments, right? So that was already a concern. And any trade war, I think, kind of creates headwinds on both fronts. You worry about more excess capacity coming your way, and when there's so much uncertainty, exchange rates are moving, there's policy uncertainty because Mr. Trump is changing policy every day. That's not an environment in which animal spirits typically functions. In fact, if you go back to 2018 and 19, what you find is even though the trade war was limited to some sectors, some countries, and a US-China trade war, global sentiment actually fell off very sharply because it was the uncertainty that hurt businesses around the world. Now, what that means is that policymakers in other countries, including India, have to ensure that on other drivers of demand, there is more visibility. That we need to offset these external headwinds with more conviction that there's demand on other fronts, right? And that hopefully will offset some of the pressures coming from China.
Okay. Sajid, we have seen China not quite stimulating in a big way thus far. It's been a conundrum for a lot of people. Maybe some people understand, but for a lot of people, they've been thinking about why is that the case? Are they saving ammo, etc.? Now, the question is, if indeed there is this large tariffs imposed and a trade war in the truest sense, would a largest Chinese stimulus happen? Part one. What are the implications of something like this? Because the hope was that if China stimulates and if Chinese demand picks up, then the pricing pressure on the rest of the world eases off. That may not eventually turn out that way if indeed there is a tariff war between US and China.
That's right, and you're right. I think there's been a lot of head scratching about why China hasn't done more. I think the one possibility or one probability, likelihood is that if you do get this US-China trade war and the growth hit is very large in China, then you actually, so you're saving some ammunition for that, and then you pull out hopefully the nuclear option, right? Which is what you really want to do in China, I think, is change the mindset that the housing sector currently faces, that the private consumption currently faces. And also I think the issue is that there is a time inconsistency problem here in China where the pressures in the housing sector are quite meaningful and are not being fully offset by China's efforts in the new age manufacturing. So there's been a big push on new age manufacturing, but the quantum of that so far on EVs and solar panels has not been enough to offset what we're seeing in the housing market, which has really been, it's kind of a balance sheet recession. And that's where parallels with Japan are drawn. That are we seeing in China what we saw in Japan 2 or 3 decades ago, and why aren't policymakers being more forceful? Hard to say from the outside why not. One view is that they know that this is a long road ahead, and so you're saving ammunition for it. And what we've seen over the last few months is every few months there are some more announcements that are made. So I think China is trying to calibrate its announcements with how the effect of the previous announcements plays out on activity. One thing that's encouraging is we've begun to see some efforts by China to improve its social security net, social safety net, because a lot of the issues in China is that Chinese households have high precautionary savings because there isn't enough of a social safety net. Now, whether that social safety net is increased in sufficient quantum remains to be seen. Okay. But at least directionally, that's a very constructive avenue that policymakers seem to be going down on.
Okay, so let's assume China does stimulate a little, but it is not enough, and therefore all of this is happening with an assumption that Trump raises tariffs from 20 to 60%. Right now we are in that umbrella.
Yes.
So if China exports a lot of the capacity which is not getting absorbed back home.
Correct.
What can other countries do? You mentioned about Indonesia threatening. I saw on your note that Thailand has also said China is a source of cheap imported goods, etc. What can other countries do to protect their own domestic sectors? Would there be counter tariffs in a meaningful way? Could this become ugly, and will it be acceptable across the world?
Yeah, I mean, let's hope we don't end up in a bad equilibrium where we end up with a global trade war, because we've seen that before many decades and that doesn't end well. I think to start with, one straightforward prescription would be, if the Chinese currency depreciates a lot, even though the risk is you get into competitive devaluations, making sure that your currency doesn't become too uncompetitive versus China should be the first order prescription, right? So think of this as being a growth shock. If this is a growth shock in the region, you want to try and counter-cyclically ease fiscal policy and ease monetary policy. Now, the problem is the difference between 2018 and 2024 is not many countries in the region have fiscal space. Public debt in most countries in Asia is much higher than where it was before the pandemic, and more than the level of debt in many countries, it's debt dynamics in the coming years that look quite unfavorable and challenging. So prima facie, there isn't too much fiscal space. So now you're left, so you've got three instruments basically: fiscal, monetary, and the exchange rate. You can't use fiscal very much, which means you must then rely on monetary and the exchange rate. as a source of easing. Now, monetary policy, ex ante, prima facie, there is a lot of space. If you look at where Asian real rates are, they're very elevated. And this is a region that is still much below its pre-pandemic path. One puzzle to observers, it really shouldn't be a puzzle, is the rest of the world saw very high levels of inflation, core inflation, post-pandemic in the last 3 years, LATAM and emerging Europe. Asia, in the last year, 18 months, has seen very soft core inflation. Why? The difference is Asia has much more slack. Many Asian economies could not provide the kind of fiscal support that the US did or some other emerging markets did. There are benefits from macroeconomic stability, but it also means that the region compared to other regions is below the pre-pandemic path, which means their slack and core inflation is low. So when core inflation is low, monetary policy in some countries has a lot of room to move. We expect, for example, we will get some monetary easing in India once the food inflation shock rolls over. We've already begun to see Korea has cut interest rates back to back for the first time since the global financial crisis, because Korea is grappling with weak domestic demand and worries about the effects of the trade war. Philippines, we think, will cut interest rates through all of next year. Thailand has cut interest rates and can do more. So many central banks will cut interest rates. Now, in that environment, it's also important to let your currency become the shock absorber and let your currency take on some of the pressure by depreciating. Because if you're cutting interest rates, but your currency becomes uncompetitive versus other regions or other countries or versus China, then in a way you're partially offsetting what you're doing on interest rates. Think of monetary conditions in an economy are a function, a sum weighted average of interest rates and exchange rates. If interest rates are lower, but your real effective exchange rate is higher, you're loosening on the one hand and you're tightening on the other. So what you really want is for both these instruments to be working in tandem. You want a slightly depreciated currency so that your exports become more competitive, imports don't become so cheap. And the good news is, because core inflation is so soft to start with, the imported inflation that you get from a weaker exchange rate should hopefully not derail the monetary easing.
Right.
So therefore, the starting conditions that Asia sees would enable it, hopefully, to do monetary easing and some exchange rate easing at a time when fiscal policy is doesn't have too much space. So I would rather that we go with conventional policy instruments. You let the exchange rate absorb some of the burden, and tariffs becomes the last resort, because if you put on tariffs, then you're in a lose-lose situation. We know that these global trade wars, everyone loses in the process. Also, people say, well, Chinese imports are 10% too cheap. Let's put on 10% tariffs. You can achieve the same objective by letting the currency depreciate a certain amount.
Sure.
A currency depreciation increases the price of imported goods in domestic currency just as a tariff does, right? So I'd hope that we go with the more conventional instruments first, right? Then have a tariff war.
How safe would India be in a world which is impacted by tariffs to the maximum order, protectionist nature, so on and so forth?
So I think we'll take this in steps. I think the first step is, as I mentioned, while India is also exposed, in Asia, we're not as exposed as some of the small open economies which are closer to China. But we need to be ready to handle the near-term hits that we've discussed from China and the trade war, number one. I think medium term is where huge opportunities will arise. Because I think if you get down this path of consistent US-China protectionism and trade wars, as we discussed, the inclination of business and FDI to look for other destinations in Asia or around the world will increase. And India is a very large market in Asia with a lot of absorptive capacity. So at some level, there's a huge silver lining to this cloud where this could accelerate that process of China plus one into India. And on our part, we have to be ready. We have to continue with the reforms that we've started on to say that this is a place that you can come and manufacture and compete and be competitive, right? And reduce the friction. So I think that's really a silver lining that we should be exploiting, number one. Number two, I know this is easier said than done, but it would be good to buck these protectionist tendencies. And what I mean is, there are unilateral gains from trade. India's export share in the world is still very small, right? On goods, it's picking up a lot in services. So even if the global pie is not increasing, India can just get a larger slice of that pie. And if that slice is larger, that can drive exports for the next decade. Right? So I think there are many moving parts here. In the near term, be clever and nimble about how you handle the shock. Prepare yourself to benefit from the medium term of the FDI that may come your way. Try and avoid as best you can the tendencies to be protectionist. Keep going back to my old example. I think there are 13 economies since the Second World War that have grown at 7% or more for 25 years. Now that's what India needs to do. We have to grow at around that rate for 25 years. Those 13 economies all had one thing in common. Right? They were all relied on exports as an engine of growth. They all had a lot of global engagement. So our global engagement cannot stop. Right? So I think that's another part that we have to keep in mind. So and I think lastly, and we've done this very well over the last decade, we're living in this truly polycrisis world. First trade war in 2018, pandemic in 2020, Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, potentially more global uncertainty in 2025. And in a world with so many shocks, you have to build lots of buffers. I think Indian policymakers have done that really well over the last 10 years, which is why we've kind of institutionalized macroeconomic stability. And I think we need more of that.
Sajid, such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for taking the time out and being with us today.
Absolute pleasure, Neeraj. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. And viewers, thanks for tuning in to this podcast on Talking Point Unfiltered.